years, Black Americans have been experiencing significant disparities in healthcare. Their life expectancy is about 5 years shorter than that of white Americans. Black infants have over twice the infant mortality rate of white infants, and Black women are nearly 3 times more likely to die from pregnancy-related causes than white women. They also have higher uninsured rates, are more likely to skip medical care due to cost, and generally often report poorer health. But why is that? The truth is, the era of slavery in the U.S. has deeply influenced the country's medical system and how Black people are treated within it. What's often overlooked, however, is that many of the medical discoveries we use today, which help millions of people, are also linked to that era of slavery. These advancements were made through unethical experiments on slaves. Unfortunately, these practices and beliefs didn't simply disappear. Instead, they left behind a legacy that continues to affect how healthcare is provided and who benefits from it. Such harmful patterns won't stop unless we address them. So today, join us as we revisit this troubling history and its impact on the current U.S. medical system. Give us a like to show your support, subscribe for similar discussions, and let's dive in. During the antebellum period in the U.S., slaves were regularly forced to undergo painful and risky medical procedures without their consent, their bodies treated as expendable for research and human experimentation. One prominent example of this is Dr. James Marion Sims. Many regard him as the father of modern gynecology. He is known for creating the vaginal speculum and developing new surgical techniques to treat childbirth injuries. But while his work made significant contributions to gynecology, there is actually an evil side to his story. The truth is, Sims performed numerous experimental surgeries on enslaved women without using anesthesia. At that time, anesthesia was already available, but Sims chose not to use it, based on the racist belief that Black people did not experience pain in the same way as white people. It's a notion that still persists today, as revealed by a study conducted at the University of Virginia in 2016. The procedures that Sims performed were extremely painful and often life-threatening. Despite this, he was only legally required to obtain permission from the women's owners, not from the women themselves. He conducted a series of excruciating and controversial experiments on an enslaved Black woman named Lucy during the mid-19th century. These experiments were part of his work to develop and refine surgical techniques for gynecology, specifically for obstetric fistulas, a serious childbirth complication. During the procedure, Lucy was naked and asked to perch on her knees and bend forward onto her elbows. Lucy endured an hour-long surgery, screaming and crying out in pain, as nearly a dozen other doctors watched. Years later, Sims would admit in writing, Lucy's agony was extreme. Sims' experiments on Lucy were unsuccessful and nearly killed her due to severe blood poisoning. Still, he continued performing procedures on other enslaved women. Sometimes, he would even drug them to prevent resistance. Sims subjected Anarcha, a teenage slave, to at least 13 operations without anesthesia before he developed a repair technique considered safe to attempt on white patients. Unable to refuse treatment or withhold consent, Lucy, Anarcha, and his other enslaved patients were powerless against medical exploitation. For a long time, Sims was historically praised for his contributions to medicine. Fortunately now, more people have started to acknowledge the cruel and inhumane treatment he inflicted on Black women during his experiments. As a result of this reevaluation, a statue of Sims was taken down from Central Park in New York City in April 2018. However, another statue of him remains at the Alabama State Capitol. It has been about 179 years since those atrocious experiments took place. Now, we are living in an era where Black people have started to regain their power. However, the legacy of medical exploitation and systemic racism persists. In many ways, Sims represents the ongoing issues in American medicine for Black women. It's a system that still does not work well for them today. There are huge gaps in healthcare between Black and white people, especially in areas like infant mortality and life expectancy. Studies show that Black patients often receive worse care compared to white patients, even if they have the same insurance or financial resources. This is a problem that has persisted throughout history. Why? Because society has not done enough to address the historical realities that have troubled Black people. Harriet Washington, a medical ethicist and author of Medical Apartheid, put it well. Trying to understand a historical problem without knowing its history is like trying to treat a patient without getting their full medical history. You're doomed to failure. For such a long time, African Americans have been mistreated by the healthcare system. Aside from Dr. Sims, many other doctors depended on slave owners for their income. They would go with plantation owners to slave auctions to check the health of slaves before they were purchased. If a slave got sick, doctors were called to treat them, not out of compassion, but to protect the slave owner's investment. After the U.S. Congress banned the importation of slaves in 1807, there was a push to have enslaved black women give birth to more children, essentially forcing them to breed more slaves. Even Thomas Jefferson, one of the founding fathers, supported this idea. Then, in the 1830s, as the movement to end slavery gained momentum, a disturbing trend called Negro Medicine emerged. This was an effort to find so-called scientific evidence to support the idea that black people were inferior. Some people, known as polygynists, used both science and religious texts to argue that different races had separate origins to justify slavery in their eyes. The 1830s also saw the beginning of recorded medical experiments on the bodies of black women. For example, one doctor performed experimental C-sections on enslaved women, while another experimented with removing ovaries, a risky procedure called an ovariotomy. Shockingly, half of the original articles in the 1836 Southern Medical and Surgical Journal were about experiments conducted on black people. Sadly, the harmful beliefs that drove the medical mistreatment of black people in the 19th century are still with us today, despite all the progress we've made in science and society. In 2017, a U.S. textbook by Pearson Education, a leading educational publisher, was heavily criticized by the media for perpetuating stereotypes on various cultures and races, including black people. One section from the book stated that black people report higher pain intensity than other cultures. While this might seem different from the outdated 19th century idea that black people felt less pain, it still reflects how racial misconceptions can skew our understanding of pain. We know that in the 19th century, the prevailing belief was that black people were less sensitive to pain, which led to unethical practices like performing surgeries without anesthesia on enslaved individuals. Back then, doctors like James Marion Sims, who were often seen as a mad scientist figure, weren't the exception. They were part of a broader norm. In the South, it was common for doctors to use black bodies for unethical experiments, and this was largely accepted practice at the time. Even though not everyone agreed with what these doctors were doing, the voices of people who protested and spoke out against these unethical practices were often ignored. As such, the abuse persisted throughout the era of slavery. Sadly, this kind of abuse did not end with slavery. One of the most troubling continuations of medical abuse into the 20th century involved forced sterilizations, a practice where black women had their reproductive abilities taken away without their consent.
While I was in the hospital to have my son, they went inside of me, and I want to tell you what they did. They gutted me open.
Riddick says she was raped at 13, had her son at 14, and then was involuntarily sterilized in the hospital. This was 1968 in North Carolina. Riddick says it wasn't until she was 19 that she discovered what had been done to her.
Here's how it happened. After the Civil War, the early 1900s in the United States saw a surge of immigrants arriving, which led to significant social and demographic changes. This influx of new people triggered a sense of cultural anxiety among many Americans and created a race panic. In response to these fears, the eugenics movement gained popularity. One of the main goals of the eugenics movement was to limit the reproductive abilities of people considered undesirable, including the poor, disabled, and minorities. The belief was that controlling who could have children would lead to a better society. This movement had various proponents, including Margaret Sanger, a well-known advocate for birth control and the founder of Planned Parenthood. Sanger's controversial Negro Project was part of her efforts to reduce the birth rates among African Americans in the South. The project aimed to set up family planning clinics and promote birth control within black communities, which she believed would improve their socio-economic conditions. Interestingly, the Negro Project had some support from prominent African American figures like Webb Du Bois, a founding member of the NAACP. Du Bois, who was concerned about the impact of high birth rates among black people, wrote about what he saw as the problematic aspects of uncontrolled reproduction in these communities. He described black childbearing as careless and disastrous, and believed that managing reproduction could help address social and economic issues facing black Americans. By the 1930s, many U.S. states had passed laws allowing forced sterilizations, which were often performed without the knowledge or consent of the individuals affected. African American women were hit particularly hard by these practices. Many were sterilized under false pretenses or without even being told what was happening to them. A well-known example is Fannie Lou Hamer, a civil rights leader who, in 1961, underwent surgery to remove a tumor, but was instead given a hysterectomy without her consent, leaving her unable to have children. This kind of procedure was so common in the South that it was called the Mississippi appendectomy. Between 1930 and 1970, it's estimated that 60,000 to 70,000 people were sterilized under these laws, with a significant number being African American women. Later investigations by the Southern Poverty Law Center revealed that as many as 100,000 to 150,000 women, half of whom were black, were sterilized with federal funding. In recent decades, black women have continued to face troubling reproductive health practices that raise ethical concerns. A great example of this is the introduction of Norplant, a contraceptive implant approved by the FDA in December 1990. Norplant was a form of long-term birth control that lasted for up to 5 years. This is a project that sparked controversy and criticism because of the fact that it was heavily marketed to communities with high numbers of black teenagers, particularly in schools in Baltimore. It didn't take long for people to realize that such programs were merely a form of social engineering that aimed to control the reproduction of certain populations rather than offering a choice in reproductive health. To make matters worse, some supporters of Norplant, including David Duke, a former Grand Wizard of the Ku Klux Klan, pushed for legislation that would offer a financial incentive to women on welfare who agreed to get the implant. The proposed bill suggested giving these women an annual reward of $100 for choosing Norplant, obviously an attempt to use financial pressure as a means to increase the implant's uptake. Although this bill never became law, the debates surrounding Norplant exposed how reproductive health programs became tools for social control. Pushing long-term contraception on black women, especially when tied to welfare benefits, was their way of managing or limiting the growth of black populations under the guise of providing medical care. Evidently, black women have been consistently harmed by medical practices throughout history. However, this does not mean that black men weren't victims as well. The Tuskegee syphilis study, conducted from 1932 to 1972, is another one of the most appalling examples of medical abuse in American history. This study, run by the U.S. Public Health Service, involved 600 black men in Tuskegee, Alabama, who had syphilis. Despite the availability of penicillin as a cure in the 1940s, these men were deliberately left untreated so that researchers could observe the progression of the disease. They were misled to believe they were receiving treatment for bad blood, and their condition was allowed to worsen over decades. The study continued for 40 years, resulting in many unnecessary deaths. And in the 1960s to early 1970s, similar racial biases were evident in the field of neurosurgery. A neurosurgeon at the University of Mississippi performed radical brain surgeries and lobotomies on young African-American boys, some as young as 6 years old, who were labeled as aggressive or hyperactive. These procedures were intended to control behavior and were even recommended for urban rioters following the Watts riots in 1965. In 1967, the National Institutes of Health and the Law Enforcement Assistance Administration awarded 3 neurosurgeons substantial funding to study brain function in these rioters. This funding and research echoed earlier harmful theories like drapetomania, which falsely labeled the desire to escape slavery as a mental illness. Again, this research lasted up to the 1970s. It is now 2024 as of making this video. When you think about it, the year 1970 was just 54 years ago. The black community has yet to heal from these atrocities. Unfortunately, those practices are not merely relics of the past. They keep repeating themselves for as long as societies remain ignorant. In late August 2021, a group of men at the Washington County Detention Center in Northwest Arkansas tested positive for COVID-19. They were subsequently moved to a quarantine area within the prison, to prevent the spread of the virus. However, in a troubling turn of events, these men were administered a combination of drugs, including significantly high doses of ivermectin. Ivermectin is an anti-parasitic medication primarily used to treat livestock, such as cows and horses. While news reports did not specifically state the racial composition of the infected men, reports have noted that prisoners in Arkansas are disproportionately black. The use of ivermectin as a treatment for COVID-19 became a contentious issue in the U.S., with right-wing groups promoting it despite lack of scientific evidence supporting its effectiveness against the virus. Inmates in the Arkansas Detention Center experienced severe side effects from the ivermectin, including vision problems, diarrhea, bloody stools, and stomach cramps. They were not informed of the drug's use or given consent for this treatment. This incident only happened years ago and repeats America's dreadful history of racism. Now, after everything, can you blame the black community if some are hesitant to seek medical help? Iatrophobia, the fear of medical professionals, is a result of this cruel history. This history is why many African Americans question why they should trust the healthcare system or seek help when it has historically treated them poorly. It is a direct response to years of being mistreated and neglected. This fear all started through slavery. The history of medical abuse and unfair treatment has created deep mistrust in the healthcare system. From the harsh experiments on enslaved people to recent troubling practices, these issues show that there's still a lot of work to be done. Understanding this history helps us see why things need to change. May we never forget the lessons of the past and allow them to guide us toward a more just future. If you found this video eye-opening, please hit the like button and subscribe to our channel so you can be part of more of our insightful discussions. We'd also love to hear your thoughts on this topic, so feel free to share it in the comment section below. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you in the next video.